Thank you so much, Godfrey. The topic of marital rape re-emerged recently in the Bahamas after negative comments were made by a visiting UN official about the country's lack of protection in the area of violence against women in marriage. Now, the Bahamas is a signatory to a number of UN conventions designed to protect the rights of women. The issue has evoked much commentary from politicians, pastors, civil society groups, and I'm sure in your own private homes and workplaces. So this morning we're going to be discussing the state of the law on the subject. And we're very happy to have with us Mr. Merritt Storr, who is the managing partner of Providence Law, and Ms. Eugenia Butler, who is an associate attorney at Providence Law. Good morning and welcome to Bahamas at Sunrise.
Good morning.
Now, we're going to get into this conversation, one I'm very happy to be having with you. But before we do that, some changes have happened in the new year,
Yes.
and you've got a new name for me, Providence
Absolutely.
Law. So talk to me about that before we get into the legal
Sure,
ramifications
sure.
of this context.
As of the 1st of January, all of the partners and lawyers who've been appearing here on Bahamas at Sunrise have begun practicing under the name Providence Law.
Okay.
Previously, we were Chancellor's Chambers, and so now we are Providence Law. We same practice, same people. We're at the same location on Village Road, same phone numbers. Everything else remains the same, but we have had a rebranding of the firm, and so we'd want people to be aware of that.
Okay, all right, so that is Providence Law.
Yes.
So now when people know that we're talking about legally attained from Providence Law, they still get the same good-looking
Same
people,
people, yeah.
same diligent, well-thought-out answers and responses,
Thank you,
just a
yeah.
different name.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we can get into the serious conversation, because I know
Good.
you're still the same.
Yes.
But we're hoping that there may be some changes as it pertains to this law. At least I know that I am. So let's talk about it and what that means. And the first thing I want to get an understanding of is, are there acts or laws that currently address the general issue of violence against women? And if so, what are they?
Yes, well, good morning again. Current legislation in the Bahamas, particularly the Sexual Offenses Act of 1991, as well as the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act of 2007, currently addresses sexual assault as it relates to the Bahamas in general, and primarily those are the pieces of legislation that we'll be discussing this morning.
Okay, so let's take a look at that Sexual Offenses Act. How does that currently define rape? And are there any specific protections for women in marriage? Because some people have said, why are we talking about this? If there's an act that says this is rape, then shouldn't that apply to marriage as well? How does that work?
Okay. I just wanted to read specifically from the sections just to be accurate.
Okay.
Section 3 of the Sexual Offenses Act says the following. Rape is the act of any person not under the age of 14 having sexual intercourse with another person who is not his spouse without the consent of that other person. So immediately there you see that the issue of consent doesn't arise according to the act if it's a spouse.
Right.
That has been extorted by threats, and it goes on to say these are the traditional areas what you would consider rape. You put fear in somebody, you threaten them, etc., etc. But the spousal portion of it is carved out, so it doesn't apply. Section 15 of the same act states that any person who has sexual intercourse with his spouse without the consent of the spouse, where there is in existence in relation to them a decree nisi of divorce, an order of judicial separation, an agreement, a separation agreement, any other order of a court, or where there's pending proceedings and there's knowledge of these pending proceedings. So in those circumstances, that would be considered, that would be an offense.
Okay.
And that's punishable up to 15 years imprisonment.
Okay.
However, outside of those provisions, there is no protection.
Okay.
And so Section 15 does address certain areas where there's a breakdown in the relationship. But in the ordinary course of relationship, there isn't anything that the Act provides for coverage.
Okay.
Okay, and so that's the current state of the law.
Okay, so this is why we have you guys on, because you bring so much clarity to what it is that we're actually talking about, looking at the specifics. So we understand that based on that, and this is going to lead to another question from me then on domestic violence. Because in a domestic violence situation, you may not have divorce proceedings or separation. You and I are very much married, we very much live together, but you're hurting me in some way. So how does domestic violence protection orders work? And does it identify sexual offenses, or specifically rape, as an offense protected under those provisions, given that that law does not?
Yes, well, the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act allows an individual to actually make an application before the court for protection against domestic violence.
Okay.
And particularly the Act actually defines what domestic violence is.
Okay.
It says that domestic violence includes sexual abuse,
Okay.
it includes psychological, financial, physical abuse of one spouse against another spouse. It could also be against a partner, a familial partner of some sort, and it could also be against a child of the family. Now, of course, these persons, the act implies that these persons must be living within the same household. And so an individual has the option of going before the court to get a protection from the court. Now, the protection order, which could possibly be granted by the court, is granted for a specified period of time.
Okay.
It could be for a year, but the Act specifies a particular period of time that allows the magistrate in particular to grant the order.
Okay.
And breach of the order actually attracts a fine of $5,000 or 12 years imprisonment or both.
Okay.
So an individual has recourse before the court. And I'd also like to point out is that the individual has the option of going before the magistrate court, which is less expensive than the Supreme Court. They can actually go on their own without an attorney and take out a summons or request that a protection order be in place to safeguard them against sexual abuse.
Okay. All right. This is very valid information. So we understand that there's some protection that you can get under this domestic violence protections. We understand the specifications as it pertains to rape under the current Sexual Offences Act. Given those things as we know them now, we already had a circulation to amend this in 2009, and that was intended to criminalize marital rape then, and of course it was not proceeded with. What was the amendment that would have been proposed then to bring this into clarity?
Well, you recall that just a moment ago I read Section 3, which says the definition of rape is that someone who is not the spouse, and it goes on to list all the aggravating offenses. The amendment simply was going to remove that provision that says someone who is not their spouse. And so it would have meant that a spouse would have been open to the ordinary course of law as any other rapist, if I use that term, is subject to. And that was not proceeded with at that time because of, I guess, the public debate, etc., that took place. And the government didn't proceed with that amendment at that time.
Okay, so it's a new year, a new government, new comments being made at the United Nations level. Just last week, the Attorney General would have said something that seemed to confirm that the government is definitely going to proceed with criminalizing marital rape now. What exactly did he say? And is that same amendment going to be what it was in 2009, or will there be changes?
Well, actually, the amendment, it seems to be, is going to be different than what was proposed in 2009. As was pointed out earlier, Section 15 of the Sexual Offences Act specifies what sexual assault is. So we currently know what sexual assault is, but apparently the Attorney General, well, the government is proposing to amend Section 15 of the Act to provide for the offense of aggravated spousal sexual abuse. And I want to make sure not to misquote the Attorney General. So it's going to be interesting how that plays out. Of course, the conversation is still ongoing about it. So it's going to be interesting, to see the amendment to the Act, exactly what is amended. So that would be an interesting conversation.
Interesting. I think that's a conversation we're going to have with him because it seems so clear the first time around. But anyway, I digress. We'll talk about that off air. Okay, so he's posed that obviously, and I'm sure the community and people are going to have a lot to say about it, as they always do. Have there been people who've really given their views on it thus far that you think are really going to play out in terms of his consideration?
Well, the bill, what they're proposing has not been widely circulated. Certainly I haven't seen it yet. I think select civil society groups may have had an opportunity to view it, but it's not in wide circulation yet. So it'll be interesting for us to actually read the amendment and how it sits in the existing Section 15. I think what it's trying to do is, Section 15 now deals with situations where there's either a separation or some known strain in the relationship that's been legally addressed. Divorce, separation, etc. I think what the amendment is attempting to do is to address what may happen in the ordinary course of a relationship, where there hasn't been any protection order, there hasn't been any court previous judicial decision of any kind. I assume that's what is intended, but again, we can't really say fully until we've had an opportunity to look at the bill, and that's why there's been a little bit of criticism, because certain things appear to have been said at the United Nations, but this draft bill has not been widely circulated.
All right, so that's a call out now, and I'm going to do that. Y'all love to do that. I will do that. To say that we need to see the bill, and we need to have that conversation. After the conversation is had, are they responsible to respond to our feedback? Does it even matter if we have these conversations and if we're saying to people, take a look at this bill, give us your comments and feedback? What is their obligation to that in terms of the amendment, and will there be any legal repercussions as a result of that?
Well, the government has the power to create legislation, amend existing legislation, and create new legislation without having recourse to the general public or the electorate. But of course, it's something that they might want to consider very carefully, because that could have political repercussions in the upcoming general election. So it's something that it should be widely circulated. Especially, it's a very important issue. You know, it's been ongoing since 2009 or even before. So it's important to get the views of the electorate before something as important as this is stamped in our legislation. So, you know, it's an important topic.
It's an important topic. So we thank you so much for getting us started on it, especially understanding the current legal framework.
Sure.
And I'm sure as the discussion comes forward, we may have you back to talk about it with us some more.
Sure.
But thanks again so much.
Thank you.
Providence, Chambers Now. Thank you so much
Providence
for
Law.
Providence Law
Yeah.
for joining us this morning
Thank
on
you.
Bahamas at Sunrise.
Thank you.
You're watching Bahamas at Sunrise, bringing you very important conversations that you ought to be having, especially with your local MP. And we'll be right back after this commercial break.